What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today, I have a special guest with me, my good friend Nick Martin from allsteelers.com. If you guys are OG followers, y'all remember me and Nick did a draft podcast last year over at All Steelers, which was a lot of fun. We got to give you all our scouting takes. But I'm excited. Me and Nick have talked quite a bit through Twitter DMs about different prospects that we've enjoyed watching. He does a phenomenal job on his draft coverage in particular. He watches way more prospects and is way more knowledgeable about all this stuff than I am. So definitely give him a follow. I'm also going to link Nick's draft guide in the description, so you guys can go check that out. It's great content. I cannot wait to really dive deep into that over the next couple of days. But we got a special episode for you guys today. We're going to talk Steelers. We're going to talk NFL draft. We're going to talk about some of the rumors that are out there right now in terms of the Steelers kind of poaching around about maybe trading for a veteran wide receiver. We're going to touch on a little bit of all that stuff. But before we get started, Nick, how we doing, brother?
Oh, I'm doing great, man. Especially like getting the guide out of the way, but hearing all the Brandon Aiyuk rumors right now, it has me just like I'm so ready for the draft. I want to see it happen because I would love to see one of my favorite wide receivers in the league end up with the Steelers,
Oh
especially
yeah.
if it's only for like a 25 first round pick potentially and maybe a pick swap.
Yeah, so obviously, I mean, you guys know, there's been some smoke around Ayuk. All that I was told weeks ago is that they called San Francisco and were told originally that he just was not available. It seems like the stance on that, regardless of what they're saying publicly, has privately shifted a little bit. There is a little more smoke about like he could potentially be moved. In my opinion, if he is moved, I think it's going to happen this weekend, just because San Francisco's in a win now window. If they are going to trade one of their best players, and in my opinion, and I think Knicks as well, one of the best receivers in the league, it's going to be to acquire draft capital that they can turn around and probably use, this weekend to get somebody to, hopefully take some of the load off of their other players offensively. But Nick, I haven't really talked a ton about like my thoughts on Ayuk, but you and I don't think really have had many discussions about this either. So I'm interested in your take about his skill set, what you would be willing to give up if you were the Steelers, and just kind of your thought process in terms of like adding a veteran wide receiver to the offense.
Sure. So the whole thing with Brandon Ayuk in his skill set, he's an elite separator who really can run just about any route. He beats some of the best man coverage guys in the league. And even like L'Jarius Sneed had his issues in the Super Bowl against him. You see his ability to attack the ball in the air. He's strong above the rim. He can separate vertically down the field. He's a strong yards after the catch threat. And of course, we can go to week one where he was putting on a blocking clinic for Christian McCaffrey on outside zone, where it just seemed like they were just running it that way because Ayuk was just opening so many holes. And Pittsburgh wants those types of blocking receivers. And when you get not only the blocking to go with it, but just an elite overall talent at wide receiver, it's worth it. Look at what the Eagles got out of AJ Brown and how that completely turned around Jalen Hurts' trajectory. And veteran receivers like that, especially young ones, they're going into their primes, they do not become available this often. And when you're in a deep wide receiver class like this, you can find a way to finagle about as much, potential leverage that you could have to get a guy like that, like let's say for a 25 first round pick, or maybe it's a 24 second round pick and a pick swap. I would definitely like to see Pittsburgh try to entertain that sort of deal. Something I would do in a heartbeat, but it's hard to know because Ayuk wants to get paid so much, and
Sure.
with the Amon Ra deal that just came out where now he's the highest paid receiver in the league, like that price went all the way up, and the 49ers are not in a position where they can really pay him, and they're going to have to act on who they want to trade him to. And it's not like they're going to trade him to Kansas City because they're not going to try and screw up their Super Bowl window even more by like putting him on the best team in the league in the AFC that beat them in the Super Bowl. So I mean, Pittsburgh would make a lot of sense,
Yeah.
especially because they could be a team that could give Kansas City problems down the line.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head just in terms of like the route running. Like the dude's an elite separator. I love the frame too. Like guys that have his type of size, the wingspan. I think he's really improved versus zone coverage. Like I have no issue with him in terms of like being able to make plays at all three levels. But understanding like when to sit down against zone. He can defeat press coverage. It's a big part of like being a wide receiver one. If you want to be considered a top 10 receiver in the league, like you have to do that at an elite level. And I think he does that. You mentioned the run after catch ability and the blocking. To me, like those two things are just kind of like cherries on the top, right? Like you just absolutely love to see like the absolute physicality and just the tenacity that he plays with. I would just really appreciate, his demeanor. And like obviously, the Steelers too, I think it's worth noting that, they typically do whenever they go sign guys in free agency or in years past have like gravitated towards those guys that have played really well against them in the past. And he lit the Steelers up. You mentioned the blocking, but he also could have caught a pair of touchdowns. They had no answer for him last season. I think he's a really good player. I would have no issue trading a first round pick for him and giving him a massive contract because I think he is that kind of foundational piece offensively and someone that you can build the entire ship around. And I think that he's that type of talent. Um, it does depend on like what they would be willing to let him go for. And if it's less than a first round pick, man, I'm doing backflips. You know what I'm saying? But I just don't. There are only a couple guys in this class that I view like as like really, really elite players or potentially elite players, and Aiyuk is already like an elite player. So I'm definitely down with that. Let's talk a little bit about real quick about Cortland Sutton. Jeremy Fowler of ESPN put out today that he that knows that the Steelers have kind of poached around and called about Cortland Sutton's availability with Denver. There's some talk about him potentially, being somebody that they would look to move, maybe even on draft weekend. In the Steelers kind of clearing some cap space by restructuring Alex Highsmith's contract, saving over $7 million on the cap. Kind of means that there could be a move coming down the pipeline. So, what are your thoughts on Sutton and him being an option? Like, assuming that Aiyuk isn't on the table for the Steelers.
So one of the most important things is Sutton is potentially looking for a new contract. I know you mentioned this to me before we hopped up on here. And I think that's a big reason why he's holding out right now for the Broncos. And if he just gets moved, I don't think he wants to play on a deal that's going to potentially expire. He wants more security. And I think Pittsburgh is could they potentially do that? They could. I just don't know if I want them to do that because Sutton he's like towards the he's 28. He's obviously still a pretty well like strong player above the rim, but he's not quite to that ability where you want to like fork over a bunch of cash like you would with Brandon Aiyuk. And I think Sutton presents more of a short-term solution, like a band-aid, as opposed to Aiyuk, who gives you a blue chip, someone to build around for years to come. And Sutton, I mean, I don't think he's a bad receiver, but I also don't think I would be trying to move a day two pick for a guy like that, especially when you look at potentially Debo Samuel only potentially getting like a mid-round pick in return if they ended up trading him to try and make room for Aiyuk. And it's like I'm in the belief that Sutton should be about a day three value or so, like maybe a pick swap, like with like 98, 121, Tyler Wise, Steelers Depot, put that idea out, and I kind of agree with him on that. Anything more than that, you're gonna lose me.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much in the same boat, right? Like, I think the big thing to kind of take into consideration here is I think the Steelers want a bigger wide receiver. And, there are only so many of those guys that are going to go in the first two rounds. Like, there are guys that they've been linked to, like you think about AD Mitchell, Xavier Leggett, even Ricky Pearsall to a degree, even though Pearsall has like more of a thinner frame where play strength isn't necessarily a strong suit of his. They, I think, want a physical outside receiver. If you look at the guys that they've, had rumored talks with in free agency, Tyler Boyd, Mike Williams, they've been connected to the two dudes we just mentioned. All those are bigger receivers. So I think that makes sense. You mentioned the short-term possibility there. I do think there's some gains there just because there's no one that the Steelers are going to get, especially after 51, that would be able to provide instant impact like Sutton could, just because there's nothing else on the roster. Like they probably need a wide receiver 2 and a wide receiver 3. So he at least gives you kind of, like you said, a stopgap over there outside. I do worry for me personally, I worry about the repetitive skill sets just because I feel like Sutton at this point in his career is a little bit more of a diminished version of George Pickens, just in terms of, he does really good playing above the rim. He can create explosive plays. He's really physical. He's really tough. I do love him as a blocker, but I don't necessarily think he's a high level separator. And I think that there could potentially become some issues because when Arthur Smith's offenses, struggled in the past, it's really been because everything gets really condensed. They don't have anything to take the lid off. There's no space in the offense. And I worry about that being a little bit of an issue if you bring in someone who doesn't separate necessarily at a high level. And I could change my mind on that because I haven't actually studied Sutton in particular. I've really just watched him a lot because I watched every pass that Russ threw last year. So I kind of had some preconceived notions based on that, on him and some of the other Denver pieces over there. But it's an interesting option. I do think that, again, he's probably the more likely scenario in this case. I think that anything involving like some type of pick swap or day 3 pick is fine. I am like you, where I would not be thrilled about giving him a contract extension on top of that, just because he's going to be 29 years old. There's no long-term pieces already on the Steelers roster right now, right? We just don't, they don't have a quarterback signed for next year. All these other pieces, like no one's actually locked in. And I don't picture myself wanting that player that you're going to quote unquote build around being Cortland Sutton. You know what I'm saying? Because he's not going to be necessarily cheap. So it just, for me, it seems like a short-term option, which I would be good with, provided the cost. But I know we wanted to talk a lot about NFL draft prospects. We're less than, I guess about 24 hours now from the kickoff of the first night of the NFL draft, which is, I know, my favorite time of year, your favorite time of year. You've spent way more time working on this class than I have. But I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on like what position group kind of stood out to you this class, or like maybe some guys in there that like made you like kind of perk up a little bit, like when you were scouting in this process.
Sure. So for me, it's the wide receivers. Obviously, like you watch the wide receivers. The big three is one of my favorite. One of my favorite like top guys I've scouted. Like I enjoy Roma Dunze's game because he not only is an elite above the rim contested catch receiver, but he's also a separator who really understands how to set up his routes. Malik Neighbors, who's an elite vertical threat who can literally take the top off a defense and would be an absolute nightmare, especially with all the cheat motions that teams are running right now. You imagine getting that guy running start? Heck no, man. That's scary. That's a scary proposition. Then, Marvin Harrison Jr., just about as complete as can be.
The prototype.
Yeah, the prototype X receiver, man. But after that, like, I think one of my favorite guys, the guy that just like made me like so excited when I watched him, was Javon Baker from UCF. I super enjoyed his tape because I think he's a guy who just plays with such violence to his movements, and it's such a breath of fresh air watching a guy who just consistent. Like, it's really funny because sometimes he won't even get targeted on a play. He will beat them so like a DB so bad, and he'll point and just like laugh at them after the fact. And I'm just like, yeah, that's that type of alpha mentality that you need. And like, I don't think Baker is as smooth or like in terms of his change of direction. I just think he's more of a sudden, like violent type of mover, similar to Deontay Johnson. You can see him stumble down quite a bit on some of his routes, but he can string just so many like moves. Like I've seen him elongate his strides consistently on his vertical plays, and it's why he's such a strong vertical separator despite not having like that
Mhm.
elite top end speed. He's great at being able to just get into a defender's blind spot, manipulate that leverage, and create open windows. And I really like him on like those 15-yard dig routes because he just consistently works his way open. He's strong catching it outside of his frame. He has a tendency to clap on the ball a little bit. That is something that you'll need to watch. Like sometimes his hands position can get a little wide. But what I've noticed about him, unreal grip strength. There's like a play um against Oklahoma. You watch him on the sideline, like it's in the end zone. He catches the ball. He actually ends up using one hand more than the other, and he just like grips it doesn't get his feet down properly, but he just grips it like palms it perfectly. And I'm just like, yeah, that guy's just got different level of
I'm a
just
little I'm a little surprised that the Steelers haven't shown like any interest at all publicly in Baker.
y- yeah, that one's a little bit weird to me. I don't necessarily think he's like bad as a blocker, but I do think he has some like concentration of like, oh shit, like they're running towards my side, and he'll like immediately perk up and stuff like that. But he's got some of that like alpha mentality. Maybe they want less alpha mentality in their wide receiver room, but I don't know, man. Javon Baker right next to George Pickens. That that would just be so fun, especially as the Z receiver, because I think he just fits really well with a guy like that.
Yeah.
And I think we both agree Jermaine Burton is awesome on tape. I just love the way he attacks the ball in the air.
Yeah.
It's something that's so special about his game. I consistently just watch him. He's so aware of zone leverage to the point where he's just attacking back to cut off their angles. And I'm just like, this is about as quarterback friendly as you can get. The only thing that's not quarterback friendly is the fact this man complains so often when he doesn't get the ball. And then you have those potential like issues that he has off the field.
Sure.
Potentially, he's potentially like the coaches like on their shit lists of Kirby Smart and Nick Saban. So you have to keep that in mind. I'm genuinely curious to see who drafts
And
him. Who
and there's
is the
it's
desperate
also
team?
worth noting though that like Kirby and like even like Saban to a degree, like you usually tell by their quotes on like who's really in the doghouse because they talk up a lot of guys that end up having like character problems, especially Kirby. He talk up a lot of
Yeah.
guys that end up having like issues off the field in the league. And when those guys are even like, oh, yeah, I don't really want to give you a good quote about this player. It does strike me, but like the talent is definitely obvious. I mean, you mentioned Burton, like the ability to win on the vertical plane. He has great sideline awareness, can high point the football, tracks the ball extremely well. I think he does a good job gearing down, like getting back out of his breaks in terms of like curls, comebacks, things like that are definitely within his wheelhouse. I definitely think like he has like a lot more room to grow just in terms of like running a more diverse route tree. But just instantly, I feel like he can be that type of like Z receiver or somebody that you just, bring in to kind of stretch the field from day one. And I think from a talent perspective, he's one of the most talented receivers in the class. He was someone that I really struggled to rank. He ended up coming in. I just went and looked. He ended up coming in 66th on my big board, which is higher than the consensus. But like, he's one of those players, man, that I feel like it's difficult to rank him because of all the stuff like you're hearing about him, like in terms of like off the field personality. He had the incident after the game that we pretty much all know about. But I do think that this wide receiver class, I agree, is just absolutely special. I just did a video on the channel a couple of hours ago that I released on AD Mitchell. That's kind of like my guy that I'm kind of planting the flag on a little bit. But do you have anybody really off the top of your head that like sticks out in terms of like maybe that you're higher on than consensus? Because that's kind of the guy for me. Like, right, like AD Mitchell is like I'm going down with the ship, like no life jacket, nothing. Like I'm going down. If he
Yeah.
busts, it's all on me, and I'm gonna look like a complete idiot in the next 2 or 3 years. But I'm just so committed at this point that there's no looking back. So like, who is that guy for you that you're like extremely high on and willing to bet on?
I think there are a few. I'm with you on Adonai Mitchell. He's wide receiver 4 for me. I'm super high on him, and it could potentially just blow up in my face, especially with potentially
Don't
a
care.
lot of teams
Don't
having
care
him
at
off their
all.
board. Don't care at this point. Just get him on a football team. Get him at the X. Just let him run vertical. Let him run digs. He'll be all right. That's how I feel. But I would say I'm really high on the Washington receivers. I have them. I had Jalen McMillan inside my top 10, and I had Polk just outside at 11. I think Polk is that guy. I actually see him better as a power slot more so than an outside receiver. I think there's a lot that he brings to the table with his ability to block. Like he gets after it as a blocker, and I absolutely love it. Also, very confusing. Pittsburgh showed zero interest in a guy like Jalen Polk, considering what he brings to the table. Reminds me of Robert Woods in that regard, but he's just strong as nails over the middle of the field. Like there were so many plays where Penix would misplace a pass over the middle, and Polk would just like go gadget arm like over above the rim, and he would just take a big hit. And I'm just like, how do you do it, man? Like he just has suction cup for hands. And then McMillan did a lot of work on this guy because his 21 tape, he was playing more on the outside. He had terrible quarterback play. And he had to deal with like not being a primary read most of the time. But I was watching him win on slants, digs, and I was just like, I want this guy outside more as opposed to inside because I think he brings a stronger overall route tree to that part of the field. I think like with the way you see slots nowadays, you need like those bigger, stronger guys in the slot nowadays. And I think McMillan translates a little bit better outside. I also think he's an underrated vertical separator. And I loved watching him against Michigan because he consistently was just putting layers into his routes consistently. It felt like he was just like subtly selling vertical steps, and Mike Sanderstill just about shit himself
Couldn't
a
cover
few
him.
times. Yeah, no, he really couldn't, and you could see him like really sell his deep stopping routes. He breaks well across the middle. Like he's got great change of direction. I think he's underrated as a yak threat. He's not going to give you a ton in terms of contact balance, but he's crafty in that regard, and he can get upfield pretty quickly. So I really like McMillan. I think he's one of my favorite Z receivers in this class.
Yeah, I think you mentioned too, like I think it's worth noting, at least from like a process standpoint. I'm curious, like if you see it kind of the same way, but like the way the NFL is trending right now, slot receivers, like you have to be able to play outside. If you can't play inside outside, I don't really see as much value in your profile. Like even that's something I look at with like Jackson Smith and Jigba from last year. I almost overcorrected potentially in my grading this year, but like I know that the NFL offensive coordinators are trying to get their best weapon inside all the time to create mismatches. In order to do that, you have to have your slot receiver kick out to the outside and be somewhat of a threat. All right. So, like, you have to be able to run a more diverse route tree, have to be able to stack guys vertically, have to be a threat out there, or else they're just going to leave you alone and start to bracket the X receiver or your superstar guy that you put in the slot. So that's something that I like put more value in, this cycle. And like you mentioned with McMillan, man, like I do think that you have to go back. I went back and watched like the 2022 tape. He was so good, and I cannot believe that like we've already kind of forgot about like how talented he was. He's just another guy that I feel like is going to make an instant impact, and people are going to be really kicking themselves on, being too low on him. But let's flip directions a little bit. Like, who's the guy for you that you maybe are like a little bit lower on than the consensus would appear to be?
I would say it's Roman Wilson. I just see mostly a zone guy that, he understands how to angle his routes and break off from leverage and stuff like that. I really appreciate that part of his game. He's also pretty tough. I like how he blocks. But if you're asking for like a potentially complete receiver, I just don't think you're going to get that much. I think he gets engulfed at the catch point. Like I've watched him run vertically, and he will just get like smothered just consistently on catch technique. It's brutal to watch at times. Max Melton kind of shadowed him in that game against Rutgers, and Melton pretty much follows him around, and he was just pressing the absolute hell out of him. And Wilson just did not know what to do about that contact. I think Wilson also doesn't really have an idea of how to set up his release plan. He has a release plan, but it's mostly like two-step stick. Yes, two-step speed side consistently. It's consistently that part of his game. And I was kind of shocked how good he was at the Senior Bowl. And I almost looked at all the reps and I said to myself, am I a hater if I find just issues with how these defenses, how these defensive players are playing him right now in these settings? Because like I was just kind of like looking at that, and I'm just like, of course a guy's gonna burn you vertically with speed when you don't have that type of speed. But it just like even on like the play like where he has that like one-handed extension, Quinion Mitchell kind of just falls down on like just a simple release and creates that space. Credit to Wilson though for an incredible catch, but I'm a little lower on Wilson than most. I would say you and I are kind of in agreement too about Keon Coleman. I I'm about the same spot. I think Coleman is an interesting one because if you move him to the slot and you run him on stopping routes and like crossers, I actually like his potential a lot in that type of role because you can give him he has really good stop start ability, and that's part of what really gives the allure to his game. He's not really a guy who's going to separate vertically, which is why you don't want to have him consistently playing outside. But if someone were to put a gun to my head and said, who's the better player?" I would say Keon Coleman, and I would go with that. You know,
Yeah.
I'd rather take my chances on Keon as opposed to a Roman Wilson.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, like the Keon thing is like so fascinating to me because I did this rant on a different podcast that I was on a couple days ago. And I mean, I can't believe we're doing this again. Like putting a big bodied, like slow, non-separating boundary receiver into the first round. And I just don't, I feel like we've seen this movie so many times, man. Like in the tape, like I don't really care as much about the 4-6. Like if he was able to stack guys or really threaten guys vertically, I don't care. Like how you do it is not, it would be something to note in the scouting report, but he didn't do it in college. Like I don't know why people are saying that he's going to do it at the next level. Like he didn't separate in college. But I do agree with the power slot thing. Like also another thing like to note about Coleman, best blocker in the class in my opinion. Like absolutely ferocious. Like the dude gets after it. And that's one thing that I really appreciate. Like he's really young, so like there's some potential there. He's early on the runway, like but not only is he like a really good tempered blocker who wants to like run through people's faces, he sustains blocks really well, which you would
Yeah.
really hope so because he's got the really enormous frame. He'll go over the middle of the field. I think he's tough. I also think like he's tough after the catch too. Like he's not a guy that's gonna make you miss, but like his big body, like you don't necessarily want to tackle him. That's why like, if you can get him in like I had a third round grade on it. If you get him in the third round, I'd feel great about it. I can't believe that it's not even just like the fact that like people are putting him like inside the first round. It's more about like just the projection. Like if people were saying, "Hey, I think he can be like either an inside outside versatility guy or a power slot, and we want to put him in the first round." Okay, like I wouldn't do that, but like people are saying putting him in the first round as an X, and I just don't. There's nothing on tape that warrants that. The other guy that I
People
kind
think
of
he's
want to,
Puka Nakua a lot, and
yeah, it's just not.
that really bugs me.
It's not it, man. I do want to hit on like some other guys. Like we talked a lot about receivers, but Talise Fuaga from Oregon State's another guy that I'm a little bit lower on than the consensus. I think that people maybe I don't really know. Like it seems like I saw someone say that he was like mocked at like 5 like a week or so ago to the Chargers. Maybe I don't really know, but he's an interesting player. He's another player that like I don't understand what we're doing. Like people are mocking him as tackles, like really smart evaluators, Dane Brugler, those guys like are mocking him as a tackle, and I don't see a tackle. I think he's an excellent zone run blocker. I think he might be the best zone run blocker of the class. Period. Understanding of angles, can absolutely blow people off the ball. There are plays where he's literally driving people into the water cooler on the sideline. His quickness off the ball, very very good for his size. I just the pass pro stuff is mind boggling to me. Like he gets his outside hand swiped routinely. Like if he plays at
Yeah,
tackle, I said this on when I was talking to John Ledyard. If he plays at tackle in the league, he is going to get cross chopped into oblivion. Like they are like TJ Watt would give him 20 cross chops in the single game because he just does not adjust. He will not play differently. He's so heavy on his outside hand. And I just like it's such an easy transition, in my opinion, just to move him inside where he doesn't have to deal with as much of that stuff. Doesn't have to deal with like protecting his outside shoulder as much, not as much in space. He does play a little bit high, which is another thing. Like if you do move him inside, but like a lot of the guys that people are saying, like, hey, let's move him to guard, which some of which I agree with, they had the same issue with like pad level and just playing a little bit high and like hands being a little wide or whatever. I think there's a lot to like with Fuaga's game. I would just be really surprised if he hit his ceiling like as a player, especially as a run blocker or as a pass protector, excuse me, at tackle. It just doesn't seem like something that's very likely to happen for me. And then just like there's a couple other guys that like, I feel like I'm a little bit lower on. You mentioned Mikey Sainristil from Michigan. I like Sainristil. I think that him potentially going in the top 50 is a little rich for me just because I saw some similar things that you mentioned in terms of like the man coverage ability. I do not think is nearly as good as like other people do. I think he's excellent in zone. I mean, that Michigan defense works on a string at the second level. He's got great ball skills, the former receiver background. I love how competitive he is. He's amped up. He wants to hit everything that moves, and I love it. There's some Mike Hilton to his game, and I'm more optimistic about him being able to turn into a better coverage player than like Mike Hilton because of the athleticism. But there's some stuff that he's not ever going to be able to overcome, and that's just like the lack of size. And like, I just wanted to see more man coverage ability in those situations. But this is a really interesting class overall. I always enjoy like, especially like after I get fully done with my board, like kind of like looking at the consensus and looking at some of the best guys in the industry, just to see like where certain people landed. Um, but let's go like to like more Steelers focus. Like, what's like who's a guy that like you really want to see the Steelers draft? Doesn't necessarily have to be who you think they'll pick in the first round, but who do you want them to draft?
Oh man, it's probably between two safeties, Dadrian Taylor Demerson from Texas Tech.
Range, range,
Um,
range.
yes, range, ability to play in the slot. I really liked how he manned up in the Shrine game. He really made an impression. And from what I gather, like reading about him, he's just really smart. Texas Tech like raves about a player like him. He's asked to do so much. And the way I noted his ability as a free safety, he tends to position himself extremely well across the middle. He knows like he's consistently ready for those tip drill type situations. He's ready to bait those throwing windows. And I just really love watching a guy like that. He's also aggressive as hell as a tackler. Like he brings his hips. Sometimes he can bring his head a little bit too often, which he needs to cut that down because that's a little bit scary. But everything else about him as a player, I'm so high on him. I remember watching him back in October. I was watching Keaton Slovis, and I just was like, "Who the hell is number one?" Because he just jumped. Oh, he just jumped like in front of the tight end on a crossing route that had no shot. This dude just jumps out of the frame like just absolute blur, and I just could not believe it at the time. The other guy I would like to see because I think he would go more towards like the later part of day two, maybe day three. Is Tyke Smith out of Georgia? I
Okay.
love his ability. I love his ability as a slot. I think because he played the star role for Georgia. He was asked to be a force player against the run, funnel things inside. He consistently did his job in that regard. I really like how he attacks blocks. I think that's a really good aspect of his game. I saw him have some really nice coverage reps against guys like Ricky Pearsall, being able to carry them across and just like not getting overwhelmed speed wise. He's a bit of a projection in like deeper zone looks because he hasn't really had that much experience in those types of roles. But I do think he has like that ability to handle like man match but schemes like quarters and be able to play from off coverage. I think Tyke Smith has quite a bit of potential in that regard. He's probably my favorite pure strong safety in this class. That a guy I would just feel so comfortable with in the box. I think he would complement Minka so well because Minka would be able to just play back and not have to worry about coming up nearly as much.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of secondary players that I really want for the Steelers. Both of which, one of which I think is potentially going to be off the board before they have the chance to take him in the second round. But like Max Melton for me, I remember like we had a conversation where I was telling you that I watched like a game and a half and I really wasn't seeing it like aside from just like the obvious athleticism. Then I started to see like watch more, just like his temperament, the way he flies downfield. He can really trigger, man. Click and close ability like off the charts. But like I think I watched like 4.5, 5 games of him. He didn't get stacked one time. Like, I mean, I watched this dude, like you said, the matchup with Roman Wilson outside and running with him on crossers out of the slot. I think he's versatile, although I do prefer him outside. But I just feel like, he's a guy who is willing to tackle. He has the special teams acumen that I feel like you really want out of your, day two ish players that you're going to draft. He's blocked multiple kicks, I think 4 kicks in college. I just feel like he's a really good player. He's got some really flashy interceptions of him high pointing the football. I think there's some potential playmaking ability that he can display at the next level too. And then another guy that I really like is Renardo Green. Unfortunately, like the Steelers haven't
Yeah.
really showed him any interest, which is baffling to me. But they did just hire his old defensive backs coach, Anthony Midget. So there is a little bit of familiarity there. I don't know where Green's going to go. He's currently, I think, outside the top 100 on the consensus board. I have him at 42, so he's probably the player that I have the biggest difference on. I think he's a top player. I'd spend a second round pick on him all day long. I love his game. I put kind of the blurb I put in my top 100 that I'll also put in the description of the video is a battle tested press corner or press specialist who is shown capable of being left on an island against premier competition. This dude was following Malik Neighbors around and did as good of a job as I saw anyone do against Neighbors last year. Complete nuisance to try to uncover against because of his impressive mirror ability, competitive toughness, and physicality. I do think he has a rigid play style that's going to lead to more penalties at the next level, which is, he's a little grabby. But I think, he like you said, he presses guys up against the line of scrimmage. He wants to be physical. He just makes everything difficult. Every time that I felt like people were throwing in his direction, it was just a chore for the wide receiver.
Yeah.
Like there was no space. He was sticky in coverage, consistently able to stay in phase. I don't know what there is. There must be something else because there's just not very many people that are really high on him, but he's going to be a one that I have no problem like going out and like planting a flag on somebody if I think that, they can come right in right away and like be an impact player. And I think that this dude's going to be a good starter. He reminds me a little bit play style wise of L'Jarius Sneed to where like there's probably going to be some penalties, but like you just got to let this dude get at the line of scrimmage and he is going to make receivers' lives hell. And that to me is worth a lot. Like I value that type of skill set quite a bit. So he's not as athletic, and I don't see him becoming quite the premier player that Sneed is. But he's a good player, man. I'm shocked that he doesn't have as much buzz, but I know that you like him a good amount too.
Yeah, I'm pretty high on Renardo Green. The thing he's 48 on my board. The thing
Smart
about
man.
him that dude, it just the thing that's just crazy about him is I see Florida State consistently. They're playing him almost on an island at times, and he is not worried in the slightest about getting beat deep half the time. And the fact you're not seeing him get beat across his face consistently, he's
He's
patient.
so patient, so
He
patient.
doesn't open his hips prematurely, which is something too many corners in this class do, and it bothers me. It bothers me a lot, but he can also come up and run support. I mean, Green has that potential. Like, I don't think he's that guy who you want. Like, I think he's more of an outside corner, but he has the capabilities to play in the slot. Like, just draft a good football player if you want. If you want a
Yeah.
good football player, just draft Renardo Green.
Yeah, I
That's
don't like you mentioned about the patience, like consistently staying square to the receiver. He has light feet. Like the issues that like I think people, I've seen some people say that they don't think he's like an overwhelming athlete, and like maybe he's not going to be able to play the same way at the NFL level. I think he's a good athlete. I don't think he's a great athlete, but he's definitely good enough and like meets the baseline. And like when you're a baseline athlete and you have good technique already and you know how to play the position, and you're probably going to go to a defense that you're going to get more help in than you did in college. I don't see how that's not valuable. I mean, now granted, like some of the people I've seen, I was just like kind of reading stuff on him earlier this morning about like zone coverage stuff is something that you can't teach. Like it's really good if people have like spatial awareness and stuff like that, but you can teach somebody how to reroute and get to the flat. Like that stuff can be taught. Like the man coverage stuff and the ability to like just be a natural athlete down the field when the ball's in the air, that's more like of the innate stuff that takes people years and years to learn on top of like him being like take the scrimmage. So I'll teach him the zone coverage stuff. He can play man to man like from day one. And I think like especially if you're a team that values man coverage, which the Steelers like to play man coverage on passing downs, I'm really shocked that they haven't shown more interest in him, especially because of like the way that he would play, off Joey. And I tweeted this out like a little over a month ago. Just let this dude, let him enjoy like crowd gas at the line of scrimmage, and let's just roll the ball out and see what happens.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on Renardo Green. I mean, the fact that they hired his defensive backs coach, though, there's at least a little bit to potentially cross our fingers on that he ends up being a day 2 pick for them. It's interesting. There's always one guy that just has that disconnect between the consensus boards and like how some people on Twitter view a player like that. And I don't know, man. I'm a tape guy. I watch the tape. I see good player. I put him high. That's
Yeah.
kind of how I feel. I don't care if he's going to be 24.
Yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't allow you the opportunity to gush about Jackson Powers Johnson on the channel. So I know we wanted to talk a little bit about like center, but just like real quick, like I know Jackson Powers Johnson for me was the number one center on my board. I had him ranked just slightly ahead of Graham Barton in the same tier, but I kind of lean that way. But I wanted to kind of let you, give you the floor, give you the opportunity to get on your soapbox a little bit about JPJ.
Yeah. All right. So I can't wait for this. All right. So he's number 8 on my board. He's right there with guys like Jerson Newton, Byron Murphy, Alou Fashanu. He is in that tier. And it's purely from a tape perspective. I watch this guy consistently just displace at the first level. You watch him with his hands. People think this guy is raw, and it bothers me. He has a wrestling background. He consistently knows how to use his hands and get guys out of the way. Like he has an anchor to be able to sit on power rushes consistently. He's so strong. Like he's 330 pounds. He's 6'3", 330 pounds. And it really looked that way when you were watching like the Senior Bowl, especially, where he didn't lose a single rep in drills that are designed to be favorable to the defensive line players. And he was just planting guys on their ass. And like you'll see him like do somersaults just finishing guys down the field. It's so fun to watch a guy like that. And also, like, yeah, he's flashy, but he also can consistently reach. I've seen him get to the 3 technique on outside zone pretty decently. I've seen him pull out in space as a lead blocker.
Excellent.
Get the hell out of his to the point where he's improvising and putting himself out there. Like in Washington State, there's a play where he's not even supposed to be the lead blocker, and he's just like, shit, man, let's just go block a guy. I was watching Brandon Thorne's interview with him. I'm just like, I want this guy on my football team, man. He's 20. He's like one of the youngest players in this class. He consistently displaces. There's no scheme limitations. Literally, the only issue I have with his game is just he doesn't play with a consistent level of knee bend. He's very tall in his. Yes, he plays very tall. But you don't see it in pass protection. He doesn't lose leverage very often. It's because he's so damn good with his hands. He's so good at just being able to torque, displace. It's all over his film. That's a guy I'm running to the dang podium for. I don't know what the whole medical situation is about there. Like I read from Dane Brugler's The Beast guy that, he suffered some concussions in his career. They're potentially like hip or hamstring injuries there. And I did note that Jackson Powers Johnson does wear the newer modeled helmet. I noted that just because I was like, he's wearing the newer model. I didn't really think much of it, but when I read Dane Brugler's guide, I was like, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Then.
I mean, I think like the thing with Jackson Powers Johnson, to me, like you mentioned, just like the things that you can do out in space with him are the really, really special things. I think that I would like to see him in a system where he can pull a lot, but I do think that him getting into the second level, him, executing reach blocks is all within his wheelhouse. I think that this dude is an absolute pest. Like he just seems really annoying to play against, and that's the type of player that I would want to have at the pivot. I think that how good his tape was in his first year as a starter was just really encouraging. You mentioned he's one of the few underclassmen in this entire draft, just one of the absolute, um, you know, I think he's got significant ceiling, like to where he could be a Pro Bowl level player. I know that you're even higher on him than that. But he's a guy that I feel comfortable with stepping in day one, and just particularly with the Steelers, like because that's some of the reason why we're talking about this, right? But like particularly with the Steelers, they've had issues at the center position for years now. I mean, this is literally dating back to like Pouncey's last year was terrible. The Kendrick Green experience, Mason Coles. I mean, this has been like 4 or 5 years running. It just seems like if they have the ability, in my opinion, like I think ideally trade back in the first round and then grab a center. Like I don't have any reservations about that because I think that he's that caliber of prospect. You mentioned the pad level thing. It is really interesting to me because I was shocked the first time that I put on Powers Johnson tape that he was 300 something pounds because of how he moved. But I was even more shocked when I found out that Zach Frazier was only like a inch shorter than Powers Johnson because Frazier plays with this incredible amount of leverage. He literally plays so low to the ground. It almost looks like some people are going to step on him sometimes because of like how he gets so low and to torque people aside to use that leverage. It's just they have vastly different skill sets. I do prefer
Yeah.
Powers Johnson, but if they do get if they do get one of those guys in the draft, I feel like really, really confident, and how that would play out. But all right, I think I don't have a ton more time to go over anything else. I think we covered most stuff. I do want to get your prediction because I'm sure that we will be talking all day tomorrow. But I want to get your prediction. If you want to give a first round prediction, cool. If you just want to make some type of bold prediction on something that's going to happen or maybe a different player they're going to draft, that's cool too. But we'll be able to clip this and put it on social media and like you can brag about it hopefully tomorrow or the next day.
Oh man. So I think if Pittsburgh stays put at 20, they're gonna take Graham Barton, but I could see them potentially pick swapping with the 49ers and trading their 25 first round pick and then going to like 31, taking Jackson Paris Johnson to go with Brandon Ayuk and basically just
Oh, we're money.
absolutely making my day. Just making the bestest of moves. I will say Barton, like he has very defined athletic testing. You don't really have that with Jackson Powers Johnson. And when you're taking a center in the first round, teams typically want the
Got
more
to be athletic.
defined. Yeah,
Yep.
exactly.
Okay. I think those are, I mean, your scenario, it almost sounds like too good to be true. That's why I'm not going to allow myself to believe in it. So, but it is, I mean, like you said, that'd be pretty awesome, man. Like the ability to upgrade at the pivot, get a superstar wide receiver, and then upgrade at the quarterback position all in one off season would almost feel like, it seems like fan fiction, which at this point it kind of is.
Go back in time and tell
Definitely fun
yourself
stuff.
this.
Yeah, yeah. I hope you're right. That would be pretty awesome. But just like some reminders, just please make sure if you enjoyed the episode, whatever, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications on your way out. Drop me a comment on what you guys think about some of the Steelers draft stuff as we head into tomorrow. Another reminder: 6 p.m. Eastern tomorrow night. I will be streaming for a couple of hours before the NFL draft begins and kicks off. I'm really excited about that. So come hang out, talk ball. We're laid back. I'm going to respond to people in the chat, all that stuff. And then Nick's big board or Nick's draft guide will be in the description. Be sure to check that out. And then my big board will be in the description as well for SteelersNow.com. I will have a plethora of draft content for you guys moving forward. I'm not planning on sleeping for the next week, so I'm really excited about that. And I will holler at you guys later. Peace.